Cars and capitalism. I'll start with a pretty simple declaration as I make my introduction here. We're not going to get rid of cars until we get rid of capitalism, period. End of story. Now I could wax poetic in a sort of science fiction meets William Morris sort of way about a future post-capitalist, ecologically sustainable, and just society with figments of my imagination based alternatively on the monorail episode of The Simpsons, the lack of the commodity form in Star Trek, and ecological travel options enjoyed by a certain Jetson family. But I won't. Instead, I'll say that even if we agree that we're not going to get rid of cars until we get rid of capitalism, we can't sit idly by waiting for it to fall apart on its own. Instead, we have to demand systemic, even revolutionary, or what Andre Gores referred to as non-reformist reforms. That is to say, reforms that will take areas of our social relations that have been commodified and decommodify them and bring them back into the commons. One doesn't have to pay to flush the toilet. One doesn't have to pay to go to the library, call the firefighters. One doesn't pay, for example, like they do in Colombia, for an ambulance. Then why should we be paying for transit? A campaign for free and accessible transit, like we've embarked upon in the Greater Toronto Workers' Assembly, goes beyond merely asking to, for example, save the neoliberal urbanism of Transit City, which we find somewhat flawed and still does not meet the accessibility needs of people in poor and marginalized neighborhoods. What we're trying to do is make a demand for free and accessible transit. And I want to just briefly touch, before I go on why people use cars and why without free and accessible transit, people are going to continue to use cars. First example, I was at a friend's going away party in Parkdale last weekend, and a group of folks from the East End showed up in one of their cars, a beater, as we used to call them, some old Oldsmobile, wonderful name. These broke, social assistance dependent people save money when it's affordable car. What would have cost $24, i.e. four $3 fares, doesn't cost a cent except maybe a few dollars of gas and perhaps a parking meter. Can we really blame people for using an automobile in this situation? This past Saturday, I was in Scarborough actually doing some organizing around free and accessible transit at a local green fair by a pretty mainstream event on one level, but on another level, a constituency open to anti-capitalist arguments from high school kids, local artisans, activists, hippies, workers in the public and private sectors, etc. In other words, making radical arguments outside of the downtown counterculture in which we're all embedded. The 82-minute transit time that's listed as the average by the OECD for Toronto is nearly tripled for some people from Scarborough. Can we really blame them for using cars? So I guess what I want to say just briefly is we in the Greater Toronto Workers' Assembly have a campaign around free and accessible transit, and I think this is something that we really, if we're going to move towards a car-free culture, at least in municipalities and urban areas, we can't just make moralistic arguments about people who use cars if they're coming from Scarborough and it takes them 3 hours to get to work downtown. We actually have to demand, at least on smog days, on weather emergency days, for people on social assistance, free and accessible transit. On June 21st or somewhere thereabouts, we're fixing the date right now. There's going to be a big mass event downtown, probably at Dundas Square. There might be some creative ways to work for free and accessible transit. So watch that space, watch the date, and check our website, workersassembly.ca, and we're on Facebook. You look for the Free and Accessible Transit campaign, and at that, we have Rick Salutin, Toronto Star, has some words to introduce them as well. Thanks.
It isn't every day you get a book about cars that two people spend 7 years on. By two people who don't drive, don't have a license between, don't have a good thing to say about cars, who actually hate cars. It's a quite refreshing approach. You know, you're supposed to actually really know your subject, which they do, and it's generally considered a good idea to have a positive relationship with a subject that you spent 7 years working on. This book really works, in my opinion, really works as a book. And I say that as somebody who actually doesn't hate cars. I've always had a license. I've always had a car. I even lied about my kid's age when he was 5, and we were at Legoland in London, so that he could get on the car ride and receive his first driver's license. What I like about most is it engages you as, it's not what I like about most, but I want to say that It doesn't just make points, and it just doesn't make arguments. It engages you as a book. It isn't just essays or insights or context. It's a real book, and in the sense that, I mean, there's really nothing much you can say about a book except, is it alive or is it dead? And this book is really alive, and it engages you the way another human being does. You don't have to like everything about it or agree with everything about it, but it makes you want to spend time with it. It stimulates you, and it makes you think. There's a real value to the point of view because it lets you see things that you wouldn't normally because you take them for granted. So for instance, in this case, basically one of the things I love about it is it tends to blame everything that's wrong in the world on cars. And as a device for a book, that works. So it's not just pollution, but obesity is the fault of cars. The brevity of language in our society, of ads and of Twitter, is actually the result, and sound bites, the obsession with sound bites, is actually the ultimate consequence of the role of billboards on highways with the rise of cars, because everything had to happen very quickly as you sped by them. It's a great obsession, I think. And it forces you to ask questions about the role of the car, a kind of moral obsession. It forces you to ask questions and follow lines of thought through to their conclusion. It's almost, I mean, I felt reading it was like watching a kind of combat between the authors and the subject to see if they can wrestle the subject into a certain shape that will prove that so much that's wrong with our society is contained in the car. And it's useful because it gets you to rethink what you take for granted. Like the chapter on segregation and ghettos and the destruction of inner cities in the US, and the role of cars in that destruction, and the fact that cars are affordable by certain groups and that can escape the downtowns via freeways that destroy neighborhoods. And give those who can't get out lung cancer. I think it's a tribute to the value of an obsessive approach or a single-minded approach, and it's fun to watch, and it's enlightening to read. And in fact, if you find yourself arguing with it, then you argue yourself back and forth, and it engages you in the subject, and it opens up new. For me, it opened up new perspectives. If you go looking for the car at the root of everything, you'll see that it often is, and otherwise you wouldn't have noticed it. It made me think about ever since I was a kid, I went to the CNE in August, and one of the most central places there was the automotive building. Never occurred to me, why is there? There was. The automotive building was there, the way Lake Ontario was there. And what the book does is it makes you think, how come there was an automotive building? There's a lot of kinds of buildings that weren't there. What did it represent? Why was it historically that at a certain time you actually get a whole automotive building as the center? And it says on it, in stone, as if it's like the Bank of Canada or the Supreme Court of Canada, automotive building. So it makes you rethink stuff that you've taken for granted all your lives. It's got wonderful details like drivers polled 7 points more favorably for George W. Bush than the overall electorate, and makes you think about freedom of assembly, that freedom of assembly as the basis of political activity is impossible if you can't walk places. It made me think about a trip I took to India with my kid last month, actually, where the driving is unbelievable. And actually, our favorite part of the trip was when we were in cars, which was how we got almost everywhere, because that was the way you got the sense of the multifariousness of the place. And the honking, which was endless, was completely different than the honking here. Here it's irritating and self-assertive. There, it's the backs of every truck and bus say, please honk. Because it's a form of communication. It's wonderful the way the book opens up all this kind of thing to you. I should also say I'm just going to sit at the back, and I'm going to have to leave a bit early because the kid who I keep mentioning has been home with the flu all day, so I won't be able to stay for the whole thing, but I should like to hear what they say. I think it's a lovely book. Thank you very, very much for inviting me.